Eudaimonia. It's, of course, a Greek word, but what does it really mean? We talked a little bit about that with Aristotle, and as you'll hear, Aristotle was probably not the one who really cemented eudaimonia. We'll talk about him a little bit later. In Greek, it probably means not pleasure, but flourishing or fulfillment. In other words, it's something that we aspire to, but it's different from America's concept of the pursuit of happiness or the American dream. In fact, probably the Greeks wouldn't have understood our pursuit of happiness in quite the same way as we see it. Would have made little sense to them, probably. Because, as was inferred by Bob in the introduction, you know, there are many things in life which are actually not that easy, but they bring great benefits and great rewards and great fulfillment. So it's important to realize that we need to divide the pursuit of happiness from the idea of the pursuit of fulfillment. And it's not just one's personal fulfillment, it's fulfillment for others as well. So it's a much more complex and lifelong effort than just going out and buying yourself another Coke. Even, you know, sometimes we can flourish under not only pressure but pain, and that also can be considered eudaimonic in the sense that it enables one to push through the pain and for a cause that is of great importance to oneself and to others. Well, the book, The Well-Tuned Brain, actually started in my head during the crisis of 2008, when, as you know, the great, wonderful growth of our economy in the years following the debacle with the dot-com era seemed like we were now going back to roses and all good things. But in fact, what happened was the whole thing crashed dramatically. I was in New York those few weeks around the time when we were all going to hell in a handbasket. And the book started really because I thought, you know, this is sort of insane. We're such a rich country and we have such a valuable connection with all sorts of things, not only the technology of the time, but also that we feel that we have a very special way of thinking about living because we have had the Enlightenment and we're the great experiment of the Enlightenment, yes? So I thought, well, how could this all fall apart like this? What was it that we were doing wrong? So the book is divided into two parts. The first part is, who do you think you are? Because it's only when we really think about that question that we can begin to think about how to live. It's unnecessary to consider living before you know who you are and how to live, yes? So, if we go back to the Greeks 2,000 years ago, yes, we find that they have a lot of things to say. They knew nothing about the brain, but in fact what we know now is, in neuroscience, something that can contribute to the understanding of eudaimonia, and that's really what the book is about. How do we use and harness neuroscience and behavioral science, as we try to do in this institute, to educate ourselves about how we might live more meaningfully and satisfying for ourselves, but also for others. So that's the subject of what I will talk about today. Well, first, we have to know where we are, yes. And we're in a very interesting place at the moment. If you look at this slide behind me, you can see that the part that we occupy in the general evolution of this planet is very, very small. And when you then look at that and exploded in the last 10,000 years, there's this exponential rise in the ability of ourselves to control the world around us. This is both good and bad, because obviously we end up with abundance of some things, but what I would say was a deficit of other things. Well, this really began, we climbed out of scarcity, and with the agrarian economy beginning back 10,000 years ago, but it was here during the Enlightenment period, not so very long ago now, and the discovery of fossil fuels and then later industrialization that really kicked us into this extraordinary growth. Now, America began at around that time, most of you will know, when the Europeans had settled here during the couple of hundred years before that, but it wasn't really until the beginning of the 1600s and then later in the 1700s that we began really to become the country that we then felt should be independent of Britain. And in that instance, we harnessed a whole series of things that we learned from the Enlightenment scholars of the 1700s, which I will get to in a moment. So if we want to ask ourselves who we are, we have to do several things. First of all, we have to think about the way in which the philosophy has driven us to where we are now, but we also have to know more about the brain. Human beings are really a composite. They basically, in a very simplistic way of thinking about it, we are layered in our brain. The primitive part of our brain, which is shared with the lizard, for example, is then built upon by the mammalian brain, and then most recently, probably only 200,000 to 300,000 years old, is the extraordinary growth of the cortex, which has enabled us to be sentient and also to reflect upon ourselves, which was what we call rational thought. So the triune brain, as it was called many years ago, some people now question that, by Paul MacLean, is a useful way of thinking about how we have evolved and why it is that we have these two parts of ourselves, passion or emotion, and also rational thought. Well, we didn't need to know much about the brain to understand that human beings are this collection of passionate thinking, but also rational thinking, because they're frequently at loggerheads. We were talking earlier, Jane said to me, she understood now that if you want to get anything done, you have to have passion for it. She was talking about Dalida and our mindful music program here at the Institute, which Jane has supported for a number of years. Dalida is passionate about music and about bringing it to a broad audience. And that is what makes it so wonderful. But she also has a very rational way of thinking about doing that. So it's when you bring these two elements together that you really have a complete and wonderful human being. But we also very often get out of sync with ourselves. This was well known to these philosophers of the 18th century. Thomas Hobbes, as you probably know, was a morbid fellow. He had grown up in the British Revolution and was convinced his head was going to be cut off any time, although he lived to a ripe old age. Bernard de Mandeville was a Dutchman who migrated to Britain, and he wrote a little ditty about bees, and he basically argued that the pleasure was the thing that drove human society. You can imagine, in the context of the Roman Church still being very powerful in England, that was essentially heretical. And so he said that it was everybody's personal pleasure and their own self-interest that drove society. It was because of self-interest, with everybody having individual self-interest, that the whole place grew. And of course, that is one of the fundamental concepts of a market society. Well, Hume, who was somewhat more temperate than Mandeville, said, yes, that's okay. Passion is going to always be the driver of reason, but you can't just resort to passion as a way of running a complex society. You have to have a balance. And his pupil, his student basically, Adam Smith, who of course is the patron saint of American capitalism and all other capitalisms for that matter, was clever enough to sort of put these two things together. And that was how we developed a market society which he argued would balance itself. It's a simple idea. If you look at this diagram here, that self-interest, which of course is passion, and essentially individual freedom is necessary for that, here, as Smith said, it's God's incomprehensible remedy. This is how society is built, thanks to God. It's our own self-interest. Curiosity and the love of novelty. Think about it. Why do people line up for the new iPhone even though they've got one that works perfectly well? It's the novelty and the curiosity. And social ambition. We're always fighting with each other. Look at the way in which we run our Congress at the moment. It's, you can easily paint on top of his ideas the self-interest part. But he said, self-interest by itself is not going to help us. We have to have some way of curbing the self-interest. And that is driven by social sympathy, as he called it. He developed, philosophically speaking, a concept called the impartial spectator, where the impartial spectator is essentially like a conscience. You think about your behavior and you reference it to those around you. You don't do things which are going to get you into trouble with your good friends, nor are you going to build goods. You don't, as a shoemaker, you don't make shoes that fall apart in 3 or 4 weeks, because otherwise you would not be a shoemaker for very long. So Smith said that the social sentiment that is driving us as a group of individuals living together enables us to come to grips with the idea that we need to be loved by others, and therefore we work hard to have others have a good opinion of us, and also to take care of them as they will take care of us. So in this concept was his idea of a self-regulating economy that would enable everybody to have their own opportunity to do as well as they could within their own capacities. Well, this worked very well in the 18th century. And we actually know that what Smith had as a concept, even though he didn't know much about the brain, is in fact the way the brain works. We have a sort of market in our own heads. Joachim Fuster, who I don't know whether he's in the audience here, but he's one of our distinguished scientists here, emeritus now at the Institute, but he has for a long time talked about the perception-action cycle, with the idea that we perceive things at the back of the brain here, and it moves forward as we begin to process the information we get. And it not only drives the limbic structures and the basal ganglia, which is the more primitive part of the brain, but it also eventually melds with those elements in the frontal cortex, so that we make decisions which are balanced between our passion and our rationality. And the perception-action cycle is continuous. So all of us are processing all the time the environment around us. But there is something else that happens too, which is that the brain is a very clever instrument, and we don't process everything from the start each time. And so, for example, if you cross your arms right now, all of you, or some of you, if you so wish to follow me, then you have done it in a natural way. And then I just say to you, so now cross them the other way. So you get sort of starting to have to think about it, yeah? Well, that's the basal ganglia at work, basically, and you do that habitually. Now, it's not just a physical thing. I do it habitually to walk, for example. I don't have to think about that. And we learn those things when we're very young, and they stick with us, and we don't change them. But that's also true of your social behavior. So when, in fact, you think about what it is that enables you to be a social being, then you have to think about what is the social input that provides you with those pieces of information. If you are, for example, introduced into life with one of those little cell phones in front of you, that is going to become habitual. And we have a lot of things going on these days in the world which are tied to addictive behaviors regarding the cell phone and other technologies that we have. We're also addicted to lots of pharmacologies, alcohol on down at the moment. The great addiction, thanks to the pharmaceutical industry, is opiates, etc., etc., etc. So the behavior that we have is not controlled entirely by our rational selves, unless we begin to make a big effort because we've gone down a tunnel that is actually disturbing and painful and hurtful to us. So learning about yourself from the neuroscience standpoint actually provides something of a template as to how you might live, because you've got to be conscious of the way in which your head works if you are going to mitigate some of these negative aspects as well as enjoying the extraordinary positive aspects. So I say in the book, to just summarize what I've said, is the book is in its prologue to part one. I'll just read you what I said. Searching for the truth about oneself is a perennial human quest. The Greeks found it compelling but challenging. Similarly, Benjamin Franklin, reflecting upon the life in his Poor Richard's Almanac, considered three things extremely hard: steel, a diamond, and knowing oneself. Today, in the hope of probing this puzzle further, once the exclusive study of theologians and philosophers, we have conscripted the neuroscientist, the geneticist, the engineer, the neurotechnologist. We've turned now towards understanding the self through knowledge of the brain. We're at a point where we can map the living brain, where we can see in real time how those who suffer with depression, Alzheimer's disease, or autism have different brain activity patterns from those of a normal brain. We can define the major networks of the brain and copy them using computer-based simulation. Stem cells, aided by synthetic scaffolding, may soon have help damaged brains and help them rewire the nerve networks of the brain. Neural engineers are designing robotic systems that can operate at the interface of the mind and the machine. This is all amazing. This is science. But, which is what I've been saying earlier, there is another equally important challenge that science, in understanding the behavior of the brain and the self, it's a task more intimately connected with our daily lives. And it's to securing our future, it's essential. We need to better grasp why and how the mass market consumer society that we have developed, in its abundance, plays on certain hardwired evolutionary drives to remold the brain's neural pathways, guide our choices, and shape our habits, compelling the unwary towards addictive self-gratification. That's a huge problem in our society now. We have discovered that a state of plenty can have unintended consequences. It's the paradox of our time. So when we think about Adam Smith, it was a simpler time. This picture of this house behind me is my home in New Hampshire, where I first went when I came from England, now almost 40 years ago. And it's a small village. It's about 800 people who live in it, and during the winter, which is pretty harsh, people helped themselves. My daughter, who lives right next door, is a veterinarian. Her barn burned down about 5 years ago, and everybody came to help with, wood for the fire that she needed because their whole supply had disappeared. The cars had been burned. She was loaned cars. But there's an intimacy in a small village which enables people to pull together. So this is essentially a centripetal system where social cohesion becomes the element of eudaimonia, the fundamental of eudaimonia. It was constrained in those days by climate, by geography, and by distance. That no longer is the case. So all of us, this is a picture I took at the Chicago airport some couple of years ago, we're now going in all sorts of different directions, and the cohesion is lost. Look at what these people are doing. This is a centrifugal society, yes? There's one looking at the computer, another on the cell phone, and another one is playing with her cell phone, probably dialing in a message. So it's a very different society, and it's one that actually brings a shift in what Adam Smith thought was a balanced market society. Self-love is running away with us, basically. And I think you can see that. I don't wish to be political today, but you can see that in the polarization of our political system as well as in the day-to-day life that we find. So we have a diminishing sense of social responsibility collectively. I mean, for example, we no longer believe in environmental changes driven by ourselves, or at least contributed to by ourselves. So we're moving now back to the sort of thing that we had 4 or 5 decades ago, where coal is becoming king. That's probably not a good plan, but we're moving back to the idea that self-interest is the driving force for our future. Social sentiment is losing. Adam Smith would be amazed if he came back and took a look at what we're doing. So we've got to put all that together and ask ourselves how to live. Well, let me just then go to our Greek friends again and say a little bit about that. This is the prologue to part 2. The Greeks called it ataraxia, the state of being unperturbed, of tranquility and peace of mind. For Epicurus, who's my favorite, it was the foundation of eudaimonia, of the joy of human flourishing. 2,000 years on, Adam Smith was in agreement. Smith considered happiness, he's the father of our market society, happiness to be born in tranquility and enjoyment, the fruit of the well-tuned brain. But human beings are not given to serenity, as I've just been talking to you about. Tranquility does not come naturally to the human mind. Ataraxia is a highly cultivated state achieved through hard work and self-discipline, that we call character. Such tuning arises from awareness of the true nature of the world and an understanding of the limitations of our being. To achieve such self-command, we must first accept ourselves for who we are. What I've been discussing is instinctually driven, curious, self-interested, focused on the short term, and ruled by habit. We, of course, combine this with extraordinary powers of reason, of perception, analysis, imagination, and choice. We're deeply rooted in our social behavior and the need for fellowship. The challenge is to bring these things together. That's what we must do if we're thinking about eudaimonia. And to create harmony, melding reason and passion to imagine a sustainable future that promotes individual well-being and observes the reality of our environmental circumstance. Ours are very privileged times, but they're confusing. None is more antithetical to the cultivation of ataraxia than a debt-fueled consumer society which in its promotion of material gluttony and creeping inequality flirts with self-destruction. How do we dig out from under this avalanche? Adam Smith considered 3 cardinal human values: fairness, benevolence, and prudence. This is our patron saint, yes? Okay? He wasn't talking about competition and all that other stuff. Healthy children flourish in healthy families, healthy schools, and healthy communities. Collectively, we thrive in habitats that are designed with humans in mind and through markets that foster opportunity and choice. The mix has not changed in 300 years. By embracing the past, we can imagine the future. So, but how do we do that? I mean, one might as well throw up one's hands, yes, and say, God, it's all hopeless. I mean, I think a lot of people were doing that last weekend. So it's a very complicated issue. So I think that that's where eudaimonia comes in, because if you're doing, it's like those raindrops on the window pane, yes? First they start, but eventually they coalesce, yes? So if each of us is working hard in our own little raindrop, and things do begin to coalesce, and we do begin to find some common cause which we can all get behind. And that's the whole concept of eudaimonia. Now, we did not invent this. The Greeks did this, as we've said, a number of years ago, 2,000 plus years ago. But their stimulus was actually very similar to what our stimulus is today. I don't know how much you know about the Bronze Age, but the Bronze Age collapsed around 1000 BC. This was the time of the Trojan Wars, and the small Greek states were fighting with the other states in the Mediterranean, and they were running out of wood, they didn't have enough grain, the whole thing collapsed, and essentially the Sea People, as they're called, nobody quite knows who they were, came in and completely demolished the civilization that was existent at that point. Nothing happened for 400 years. Whole societies and cities disappeared, basically. And then, slowly, there was a seeding of these small communities, mainly in Greece, what we now call Greece, and around the rim of the Mediterranean, Italy, some in what we now call Turkey, and so on and so forth. So the Bronze Age collapse was the stimulus to the thinkers that we now revere as the Greek noetics. Bob mentioned Aristotle. He was one of the most important ones in that cluster at the top there. But most of them believed that pleasure was something that was not important. The most important thing was intellectual judgment. And that was all well and good, but it didn't serve the natural purpose, because we're all passionate, obviously. And my favorite, as I said earlier, and so you had the skeptics and the Stoics and so on, and we could talk about that, but more than that, I want to just bring you to our present challenge again. And so Epicurus, I think the Epicureans in general, because he, like all these small Greek communities, were a group of individual philosopher types. Probably we'd have considered them to be on the very edge of society these days. But he lived in something called the garden, and he ate vegetarian and all that stuff. We can really relate to that. But he flourished in a as he said, a self-sufficient life, that he did most of it himself, and he was surrounded by his friends. Now, a lot of his writings have been lost, but he believed in freedom of choice, of course, but he did not believe in dividing reason from passion. He thought that was a false dichotomy. Here is one of the things that he said, which survived. He wrote several letters to important people. when we say that pleasure is the end, we do not mean the pleasures of the dissipated and those that consist in having a good time, as some out of ignorance and disagreement or refusal to understand suppose we do, but freedom from pain in the body, aponia, and from disturbance in the soul, ataraxia. For what produces the pleasant life, read Eudaimonia, is not continuous drinking and parties or pederasty or womanizing or enjoyment of the dishes of an expensive table, but sober reasoning that tracks down the causes of every choice and avoidance and which vanishes the beliefs that beset souls with greatest confusion. That's the actual, I can't resist this, you'll forgive me and boo if you like, but that's the path that goes from adolescence to the Supreme Court. So to flourish in life lies not in blind competition, but in thoughtful reflection, cooperation, collaboration, and friendship. And we can still do that, regardless of how crazy a time we're living in. Yeah? That's the little droplets on the window pane that coalesce into something important. So that's what the second part of this book is about. Now, this may be a little small to read, maybe not for those of you in the front, but most of my books are tied back to personal experience, and then I try to take the personal experience and create a sense of how you can understand them from neuroscience and use that as a way of thinking about how behavior can be driven or how it's become disturbed. So I ask, for example, and these are some of the chapters that are in the second part of the book, if we turn away from modern myths, of which we can give a long list very quickly, I do love the idea that actually we might eventually end up on Mars, but I'm not quite sure exactly how it will help us. So, for example, I write one chapter, which I'll tell you more about in a minute. What can we learn from a sheep farm in Vermont? Yeah? About human love and attachment. How many of you remember persons who you were taught at school, who the characters who taught you? Yeah? I remember them distinctly, but I don't remember necessarily what they taught me. I had a physics master who used to, in those days, we used to use Bunsen burners, and he would hold his trousers up with a piece of rubber tubing, you know, that you would put on them. And his name was Mr. Wesson, and he never shaved his cheeks. He would play with them during the lessons, and he was a wonderful eccentric character. He had one of these machines where you could develop static electricity, which actually was invented by the Wimshurst, a man named Wimshurst. So he would bring out his Wimshurst machine, put it on the table, and then, of course, it was driven by a handle, which, of course, had a crank. And so he would say, "This is the Wimshurst machine. It's driven by a crank." And there he was. And, of course, there was always a titter in the classroom. And he would say, "Who laughed?" And he had to write the date in his way. If you were staring out of the window, suddenly you'd have a hot hand behind your neck. He was a character, but we all were terrified of him. But we all loved him at the same time. And we learned a hell of a lot of physics, I tell you. So it's the person that makes the difference, yes? It's the attachment. It's the thinking about the person who's next to you. And not just friends, but people in the community. Habitat. You know, what can we learn? In the book I talk about Sabagnetta. Some of you may have been there. It's a classic Roman town in the northern Italy. But it never worked because it was designed by one person. It never functioned as a social organization. And so you can learn a lot, because many towns in Italy, as you know, function extraordinarily well, even now. So you can learn about thriving habitat. What is it we need to put together to have a thriving habitat for human beings? These are all the roots, the foundations of eudaimonia. Because if you can bring these things together, people thrive and they love it. Food is another one. I mean, have you ever wondered how you supply a city like New York or London? I mean, there are people who specialize in that, and it's fascinating, you know? Imagination. We all have imagination. How do we use it? When did it begin? I mean, how many were we as imaginative as this 300 years ago, 300,000 years ago? Probably not. I mean, there's a lot of evidence that those wonderful cave paintings in France, the imagination, those hands that they have on the wall and the cracks, it's almost as if the person is going into the cave trying to find in the imagination the ancestors, yes? Lots of interesting stuff. And then wisdom. As we put all this together, why can't we think through a sustainable future? We can. It's just we have been preoccupied, so we don't. Let me tell you just one story, and then I'm going to close. This is my granddaughter, actually, when she was somewhat younger than she is now. But the story, she lives on a sheep farm, which her parents run in Vermont. And this lamb she's holding is one that was rescued by her mother and herself when she was much younger, when the lamb was much younger. These are Icelandic sheep, and they are extremely hardy. And the Vermont weather is such that, of course, they have to be hardy, because at the time that they're born, the old coyotes are up there on the hill singing and yapping and looking for a good meal, because they're pretty hungry after the winter. So one of the sheep that they had when they started off this flock some time ago now, it's quite large now, but was named Russet. She was a rather older sheep, and she knew how to take care of things. But she was also a sheep that stole other people's lambs, and so Russet, who was always on the lookout for another child, she very often would take the lamb that had been born from a more naive sheep and nurture it, even though she was pregnant herself and later would have a couple of lambs. Well, this in fact was, in this particular story, which Wren, my granddaughter, loved to hear. She loved it. She loved the repetition of this story. And the story was that Russet had stolen another sheep's lamb, and then when her lambs came along, two, they usually have two, the bigger lamb had already bonded with the mother, and there wasn't much chance for the two little lambs to have any nurturing. And so Helen had discovered this in the middle of the night, and she brought the two tiny lambs into the house, one of which was almost dead, the other also very severely dehydrated and cold, and they fed them all night with a tube, which is, one of them died and the other survived. The one that survived is Ruby, which is this one here. And Wren bonded with this sheep in a way that was just as she would bond with a sister. And so for the next 2 years, they were inseparable. And then Ruby, at the age of 3, had a baby, because that's what sheep do when they're 3 years old and they're running, you're running a sheep farm. Because Helen, this is not a toy sheep farm, this is a real sheep farm, yes? And so Wren was distraught, totally distraught. And Helen couldn't figure out what was going on. She said, well, I'm going to lose Ruby. Now she has a baby of her own, and we're no longer sisters, yes? See, she was about 5 at the time. what you see going on there is that the fundamental attachment that we have, that, for example, Helen, my daughter, has for Wren, her daughter, is the same as that fundamental attachment that sheep have to each other, and it's absolutely necessary, in the case of the Icelandic sheep, that that happens within a few minutes of being born. The smell, the attachment, the warmth, all those things have to happen. That's all biological. But we have the same sort of things in ourselves. You know, those of you who've had small children, you know, had babies, in their first 6 weeks of life, they are so totally dependent. But it's amazing how quickly they start to grow, and it's that attachment that makes the huge difference. And it's driven by things we know about, vasopressin and so on, in a way that we can explain it, but we have to also recognize that it's one of the fundamental underpinnings of our society, because out of this love eventually comes trust, yes? I mean, if the parent does the right things, the individual trusts them to provide for them, the small individual that's growing. But then they start to do all sorts of things which are not in their best interest, the child, and the parent corrects them. It's only when they're within a trusting relationship that that correction is going to have some impact upon the habit formation. And this is what eventually ends up with character. And the fact that Wesson would come and grab our necks and tell us to pay attention when we looked out of the window, that was another form of attachment and trust that we had in him, that we knew he was thinking of our best interest in the future. So that leads to self-command, because eventually what happens is that we are able to do that for ourselves. And that if we live in a habitat that enables us to do that with others, then we grow in strength, etc. So you can see this is a continuum, yes, along the bottom of that line there. And eventually you get to wisdom. And that is essentially what eudaimonia is. So how do institutions fit into this? Well, institutions matter a lot, because I'm sure all of us in this audience try to move forward in these helpful ways. And the eudaimonia that we get from it, the sense of flourishing, the sense of caring, it's very much obvious here in the university. It's here in this institute that we help each other. We nurture the 300 students of one sort or another that we have, and the medical students too, etc., etc. And that's what this institution, UCLA, does, actually. We do it pretty well. And I think the Healthy Campus Initiative, which was mentioned at the beginning, which actually Jane, her husband, Bob and I were fantasizing about being able to do this, but Jane and her husband came along and did it. And so slowly what you have, as this piece from the Chancellor in January 17, just after the last election, said, this is a time of polarization, and UCLA proudly brings people together to work for the common good. This work is about more than feeling good, it's about doing good. That's when eudaimonia comes into being. That's how you feel. When you feel that way, you are being eudaimonic, not demonic. So, Chancellor Block understands the Jane and Terry Healthy Campus Initiative is a part of what we do here, and it's extraordinary. I mean, we have now over 5 or 6 years, I guess it is, Jane, we've developed a program which is university-wide. It's, I think, the envy of many other universities in the country, and it's to be celebrated. But it's all done by individuals working together. So we don't need, although the times are extremely difficult, and one might think that we're all going to hell in a handbasket, I think, in fact, by just being who you are and working with each other, we can do things that are very meaningful. And I think, I'm an optimist by nature, I think that that will eventually prevail. So that's the message of eudaimonia, and the roots of it are in terms of promoting human flourishing, are very mundane. They're just what we do naturally every day. So we want to thank Jane and Gwendolyn, who now runs the program, and remember that human flourishing is nurtured by lives well lived. That's what it's all about. Thank you.